we go. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for joining us for our lunchtime. If you're joining us from the lower 48 or evening, if you're joining us from across the pond, we're super excited for this tailwater fishing masterclass with Hardy. So just a couple quick housekeeping things that I want to go through quick before that we pass it off to our guests. We just remember that your video and your sound are off. So if you've got kids or dogs running around in the background, or if you're sitting at Chipotle eating your lunch trying to join us today, don't worry about it. We can't hear you, we can't see you. And make sure that if you drop down into that lower bar in Zoom here, you can see there's the chat as well as a Q&A section. That chat, let's make sure we use that for chiming in where you're joining us from today, things like that. And then that Q&A section, if you've got any questions that you want answered at the end of class, make sure that's where you drop those. Just kind of keeps it easier to keep track of those things as they kind of come in. The last thing I want to remind everybody is that this recording will be uploaded to Trout Routes' YouTube channel either later today or early tomorrow. And all of the attendees today will be getting an email with a link to that video coming tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that. So if you miss anything, if you got to step away from your computer for a couple minutes, or if you just want to jump back in and watch it all again, you can definitely do that over on our YouTube channel. So, as you can see, I'm joined by not just one, but two guests today. So, without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Trout Routes' very own Eric Johnson to get things started.
Hey, everybody. Thank you, Matt, for that intro. Appreciate everyone who is able to make the time today. And I am absolutely honored to have Howard Croston join us from across the way. Howard is the global brand and product manager at Hardy and Grays, and we've gotten a chance to know each other over the last couple of weeks, and I'm really, really excited for our conversation today. We're hoping to dive really deep into some tailwater tactics here, and I'm going to turn it over to Howard to kind of kick us off. But Howard, great to see you. Thanks again for joining us.
Great, thanks a lot, Eric, and thanks everybody for joining in on the call. When the guys asked me to put something together about fishing sort of tailwaters and tailwater tactics, I had in mind, I tried to think about, what I could get across in the time we had available that would have, best effect for the widest cross section of sort of viewers. So what I sort of decided to do was go from quite a high level view of basically how I personally sort of pick the methods and approaches that I'm going to use on specific tailwater venues. Now, one of the things with tailwaters is they can take many, many different forms, and they can lead to lots of different kinds of fishing, or lots of different kinds of appropriate fishing. So we'll dive into some specifics around the techniques that I use. And hopefully towards the end, when we get into sort of the questions, if there's any specific questions about that, throw them up there, and hopefully we can get to them and talk about it. So the first thing is that is not a picture of me on that first slide, just to point that out. But this is me. So I throw this in. This is just a bio. I'll fly through it very quickly. Really, only the first 2 points are the most valid. The main one being I've been an obsessive angler for the last 41 years. It's been my entire adult life and life as a kid as well, to be honest. And yes, that is me in the bottom right-hand corner. So for 23 years, I've been at Hardy. I'm the global product manager. I'm responsible for the design and development of a lot of the products that we sell. And I guess I'm reasonably well known now globally for doing a lot of competition fishing. I won't bore you to death with it. I'll fly through it all. I have done quite a lot of different things, which really the only thing of it that's relevant to this is it's enabled me to fish a lot of different places globally with a lot of very, very good top flight anglers. And as a result of that, I've learned a huge amount. So I'm very, very grateful for that.
Howard, I want to stop you for just a moment and commend you on your resume. It's incredibly impressive, and I've had a chance to kind of dig through some of this over the last few weeks. I want to remind everyone, if you have questions, to go ahead and throw them in the chat. We'll do our best to get to them here, but you have direct access to one of the best anglers in the world this afternoon, and I want to make sure that we can really pick his brain here. So I'm super excited, Howard, for everything that you're going to show us here. But I'm also excited about some of the questions that we're going to field on this conversation.
Awesome. No, thanks for that, Eric. So we'll dive into it. I'll just touch on the competition thing a little bit as well. Now, obviously, competition fishing's not for everybody, and I get that. That's great. For me personally, throughout my fishing career, it's been, I would say, that the one defining thing that has driven me to improve my personal fishing, my approaches, techniques, the way I go about things, with a very clear end goal in mind, which is to succeed at a very, very high level. And for me personally, I've found a lot more positives from the competition fishing than I've ever found negatives. You know, um, from a pleasure fishing standpoint, you can take some of the competition side of it, or you can leave it. It really, doesn't matter. Fishing is what you choose to make it. As long as I've got a flower in my hand, I'm quite happy, whether it's in a competition or whether it's not. So we'll move on. So we're going to talk about tailwaters, and tailwaters effectively are trout paradise for the most part. Um, Really, the definition of a tailwater is any water located downstream of a hydraulic structure. So anything, typically it's a dam of some description. Now that brings some significant benefits to the environment that we're fishing in. Generally, they are stable water conditions. I say generally, it's like anything else with the way our weather's changing. We do get high water events. You occasionally get dam malfunctions. That happened a few years back out west, quite notably when one of the major tailwaters out there dropped to nothing. So generally speaking, they're stable water conditions. Those stable water conditions gives you an increase in biodensity, optimal conditions for the population of fish to grow. So there's a lot of fish, generally speaking, in tailwaters. Generally being the operative word. Not all tailwaters are blessed with the same conditions. Generally, there is a slight reduction in many cases of biodiversity. So there's less bugs, but there's often more of them. But that's often outweighed by an increase in the amount. So you often get a larger average size of fish. So, some tailwaters, a lot of fish, of a big average size.
And Howard, just to clarify there, you're mostly speaking about the variety of bug life, not the quantity, right?
Yeah, so you'll often on some tailwaters you'll see there's a slightly lower spread because the water type is dependent on the tailwater. Some tailwaters are, I mean, if you look at the Missouri, for example, the Missouri, that section that I think is below Halter Dam, very stable, quite laminar flow conditions. Um, you know, Potentially slightly lower spread of species, but a real big number of certain ones.
Right.
So at the end of the day, it's all good. Stable water conditions and bugs, whether it's a lot of different species or super high numbers of a reduced species, it's all food.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, and I think you're kind of describing some of those ideal waterways for catching trout, but I know we're about to jump into some of these challenges here. Of course, it's not easy most of the time to catch these fish in these tailwaters in particular.
No, they can be difficult. There's challenges to all fishing, irrespective of where it is, how many fish there are, how much pressure it gets. There's challenges. So we'll dig into a few of those, and I'll sort of go through a few of the ways I sort of approach that.
Sounds great.
So I mean that's a shot. Basically, that's just the Madison River. That's downstream. It's in the upper river. That has a high biomass, a stable flow volume of a tailwater, but it also has got a lot of insect diversity, mainly because it's got a lot of structure. So it's got the characteristics of a freestone river, but it also has the advantages to some degree of a tailwater also, because obviously
Right.
it's coming through a dam system. And those of you that have fished there, I've been fortunate. I've fished there an awful lot. It has a very, very high population of fish, and it has some good size fish as well. And then if you go much further down on effectively the same system to some degree, you have a river like the Missouri, which has got very high biomass, but a much, much different profile to the flow of the river. It's much more laminar. It's got high weed growth, but there is less in-stream structure. You know, the weed growth is in-stream structure, but it doesn't have the boulders, the rocks, the log jams in the same way that the Upper Madison would have. However, they are effectively both tailwaters. So understanding the best way to approach those kinds of water is really key to, in my mind anyway, to maximizing it. And when I travel, when I arrive anywhere in the world, to fish a section of water like either of these two, I pretty much use sort of a set approach almost to both types of fishery. The common factors between both of those scenarios is there's a high fish density. That basically means whenever you've got a high fish density, you typically have increased angler pressure, and that leads to technical fishing or difficult fishing. Obviously, the more fishermen, you know, it can make your fishing more difficult. If you're fishing behind, you know, 10 other guys up a section of river, quite often it doesn't necessarily bother the fish. They've still got to eat. It just makes them slightly trickier to catch. So as we dive into some of the sort of methods that I've broken out, or the overall approaches that I've broken out, we can look at some of the detail, if you like, that in my mind makes a big difference to it. So the differences, they're pretty obvious. If you're a regular angler, you do a lot of fishing, you'll recognize the obvious differences between, you know, these two sort of venues. Obviously, that a river like the Upper Madison, it's quite a complex, turbulent environment. Now, for me personally, I find turbulent water like this easy to read. I'm quite, you know, adept at looking at this kind of water and working out where fish will be. That's not the same for everybody, particularly if you're not used to fishing a river that is effectively all riffle water. So I would generally categorize that on average as a complex environment to read well. Part of the reason of that is, whilst at first glance it might look easy, those fish can be in a number of different places for different reasons. You can often find fish stacked up in incredibly shallow edgewater right up against the bank. You can find them in deep slots in mid-river. It really does depend on, you know, to some degree on time of year, prey items, and even down to angler pressure. So it can be more complex to read and to understand. It is easier to approach, and it's arguably easier to manage from a fishing perspective. You know, we've got broken water surface, which typically means we can approach a lot closer. And, you know, that broken water surface and in-stream noise helps shield you from the fish. It helps hide your presence. When you look at those less turbulent waters, more placid, personally, I think they're less complex to read. Some people look at flat water and think, you know, this is a challenge. And typically, I mean, it's become a real big thing now in the US. It never used to be, but obviously the whole Euro nymph, contact nymph, tight lining thing has had a huge surge in the States. When I very first started coming over to the US, I was doing European nymphing style talks more than, it's like 15, 18 years ago now. And I was getting some very strange looks. You know, people were like, you know, I don't really get this. And, you know, why are you using an 11-foot rod and all that kind of stuff? That's obviously changed in the last few years, particularly in the US. But in terms of those placid waters, they can be, I personally think, less complex to read. One of the reasons being you can often see the fish. You can actually see them where they are in the stream. You can actually watch the behavior quite well. I was on the Missouri back in the summer, walking along a high bank, you know, and I could see pretty much where every fish was within visual range. You know, they're up and they're cruising, and I can see them eating. and I can, make an assumption that they're eating, crest bugs or sow bugs because of the number of bugs of that kind that are in that river, and there was no hatch. So in that respect, it's easier to read. Those fish typically are harder to approach and they're harder to manage well because the advantage of us being able to see them easily plays to their advantage. They can often identify, that there's an angler close by. So those for me are the two sort of main ways I would break it down.
Howard, before you move on from there, if you want to just bump back a slide real quick, I wanted to call out that term laminar flow, and it seems that you're really using that just to describe water that perhaps looks still, it's still very much moving water. However, it's not the turbulent sort of opposite that you described.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I'm glad you've mentioned that. The Missouri in particular, and other waters of that kind, because the flow looks relatively smooth, you haven't got that broken, disturbed
Right.
surface, does not mean it's all moving at the same speed. It's the exact opposite. It is still a very, very turbulent environment. There's an awful lot of drag that can be created in that kind of water, which does make it harder to manage. And one of the big killers in tailwater fishing, or in that kind of tailwater fishing, is the avoidance of drag.
I've had a chance to fish the Missouri a couple of times, and you're absolutely right. Often, or at least in my experience, you'll have a very short window where you'll be able to successfully drift your fly before it gets tangled up or swirled around in the 3 or 4 drifts in between where you're standing or where you're sitting and where your fly's actually landed out on the water.
Yeah, no, 100%. It was, I'll be honest, when we fished it, it was the first time I'd ever fished the Missouri. And I'd read a little bit about the complex nature of, dry fly drift and all that kind of stuff, and how difficult it was, and the need for certain, casts that everybody knows, long downstream reach casts, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Luckily for me, I was armed with something which we do a lot in competitions, which overcomes a lot of that. And we'll dig into that when we get a little bit further
Perfect.
on.
Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah. So, right, okay. So, most of the techniques we're talking about are weight based. Obviously, you can drift boat fish on these kind of venues, but personally, I mean, I like to drift boat fish like anybody else, but I also like to do a lot of wade fishing. So everything I talk about really is going to be wade based because I think on balance, tailwaters can be big, small, medium. Not all of them are fish from a drift boat. So I think on balance, if we stick to sort of like some wade based techniques, I think that's probably going to be the sort of the best approach. So again, same shot, Madison. Turbulent, easier to approach and arguably easier to manage. So that leads me, in my mind, if I'm walking up to a river that looks like that, anywhere in the world, pretty much, basically that's going to lead me to think, right, I'm able to approach closer and I'm going to, employ a shorter drift technique. So a technique that does not involve drifting over a long area. Because generally speaking, A, I don't need to, and B, the river is not set up in a way in which the fish is able to track a food item over a long period of time.
Right.
So obviously, like any other kind of fishery, it varies. There will be slots, maybe bankside slots, where you have a longer slick, where you're going to get a long drag-free drift where a fish is able to, you know, identify a food item, lift it, track with it, satisfy itself it's not attached by string to the angler or to an angler, and then eat it. You do have them scenarios still. But in general, because we've got so much in-stream structure, the drag or the drift window is appreciably shorter than it is on a very, very placid river.
I think that's a really good call out and good reminder. I think I sometimes get caught up with thinking that the longer the drift that I'm able to execute, the better chance I then have of hooking a fish. But because of the way that the structure is in these types of turbulent systems, that window actually is quite small. And it's not as,
Yeah.
you're perhaps not hitting 2 or 3 or more of those sections in a single drift. You should probably approach them independently and cast shorter drifts to each of those sections.
Yeah, 100%. And what I would say is I would always encourage people. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what technique you're employing. Um, Quality of drift is
Right. Yeah.
is the thing. You know, you can make a huge, big, long drift that's poor and with limited success. Make a very short drift that's very, very good and have immediate success.
Right. Yeah.
And one of the goals, and again, it goes back to the competition angling that I do and the competition side of me. We sort of always try to catch a fish if we're targeting a specific piece of water with the first cast by getting as clean a drift as possible that very first time. There are multiple venues around the world which receive an awful lot of angling pressure from very good anglers. Some of the rivers in Spain, as an example, where if you show that fish the fly and you get a good drift first time, it will eat it without even a second thought. If you get a less than optimal drift and that fish moves to the fly and then decides not to eat it, that fish is shut down. You know,
Sure.
it is not eating it again for a reasonable span of time. You know, they can be very, very tuned in to being pursued, you know, particularly when they've got a lot of very, very good anglers chasing after them, you know. Spain as
Yeah.
a country does very, very well in competition fishing. They're of a high average level. And that in that country in particular, it was very, very obvious.
Mm, that's interesting. I think when I approach a new drift and I get too in my head, I often think to myself, all right, I've got one shot to nail this drift, and that's usually the cast that lands 6 inches, 12 inches too far, and I end up getting snagged in an overhanging branch or something.
Yeah, no, that's it. I mean, I often say when I'm coaching people, and I do quite a lot of coaching of competition anglers who want to get better and stuff like that. And I will often say to people, you know, I would rather, you know, over a period of time, say that you make 50 drifts with real intent, real good quality drifts than 150, you know, that are poor,
Sure.
you
Yeah,
know.
no, I think that's another great reminder too, and perhaps to take a few moments to analyze and assess the water before you just start throwing your fly in and crossing your fingers.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, one good tip for getting good drifts on any kind of water is to look at surface debris. If there's
Hmm.
anything on the water, either be it foam, any organic material, or obviously ideally fly, is
Hmm.
is watch how it's drifting, you
Yeah.
know. So when we get onto some of the dry fly stuff a little bit later on, I'll touch onto a few of those bits and pieces. So that's the closer, shorter drift techniques, and obviously placid, harder to approach, harder to manage. For me, that always leads me to some form of longer approach with a longer drift technique. So basically, I'm then looking to often maximize overall length of drift, particularly when the fish can see it coming sooner. You know, it's not a food item that's getting washed into a pocket where they're lying. It's a food item that's coming along an often complex surface current from a distance out. And that's where the quality of your drift, particularly over a longer window, becomes really, really important. You know, you'll see fish in very, very heavily pressured sections of water, even sometimes with a real bug, will roll up under it. They'll break off the bottom. They'll drift off. They'll keep coming and coming and coming with it. They'll track it. And rather than intercepting it in the normal way, like an unpressured or a happy fish would do, where it'll just literally take it off the surface and glide back down, you'll see them swivel, you know, under it and track it and follow it a little bit.
Sure.
you know, and until we catch a talking one, you know, until you actually catch a talking fish, nobody really is going to be able to tell you why.
Right.
Is it the drift? Is it the fly pattern? You know, who knows? I keep trying to catch a talking one. It's not happened yet.
One of these days, Howard.
Well, you know, I'm working through them one at a time.
That's right.
There might be one. Right. So, in terms of it from a style standpoint, that closer approach on that broken water, for me, generally leads me into a contact or a Euro style of fishing. Because whether you like that kind of fishing style or you don't, for me personally, I think it's one of the most effective methods there are to fish a host of different flies and a host of different sort of side techniques. You know, there is a bit of a, if you like, a commentary out there that, you know, some of these techniques aren't fly fishing, it's just lobbing, it's this, it's that, the other. I can assure you that, like, at the really high level of these kind of techniques, it is difficult to master it well. It's a hard thing. It is very, very successful, and it's a really good gateway for some people into fly fishing, because it does, even done moderately well, you can catch a lot of fish with it. So for me, as soon as I see water structure like that Madison picture there, I'm going contact fishing, generally speaking, unless I've got some bigger, flatter dry fly water, and I'll be doing it off the end of a long level Euro leader, and that's nymph, either a single or a pair of flies where it's legal. Dry dropper, that is my preferred method of suspension nymphing. I'm not a big bobber guy. I do fish them, mainly from a drift boat when I'm having a nice relaxing day off. You know, I put a beer in the beverage holder at the front, and I throw a bobber because it's good fun. But for me personally, that's not a mainline attack. I prefer to fish dry dropper style if I'm going to suspend something.
Sure.
And then obviously streamers, you know, you can jig streamers super effectively off the end of a long Euro leader. Fishing the dry fly, I do see this quite a lot. You know, really, you sort of have to understand that, like with all fishing types, there's compromise. So you will see people say, oh, you know, I fish, you know, they'll say, I fish the dry fly off a Euro style setup just as effectively as I fish the nymph. You can fish a dry fly off a Euro style setup. In order to do it effectively and well, you have to really sacrifice a lot of the advantages of fishing very, very light and very fine as a Euro setup. You need to start building taper. You need to start adding some mass to everything. And that detracts from all of its other main advantages. So for me personally, I avoid the dry fly and anything approaching a Euro rig. I don't fish it. I only fish it as part of a dry dropper setup.
Gotcha. And I suppose one other thing just to maybe throw into the conversation is whether or not you're into any of these techniques or approaches. I think what is important is having some exposure to them so that you can outfit yourself for different scenarios. I know some folks are, you know, will only ever tie on a dry fly, and I think that's great, but then that would potentially limit you quite a bit depending on the current conditions or what the fish are doing and things like that. So whether you're into contact or your own thing, or whether you're dead set on throwing a dry dropper, I think understanding the different techniques can often open up quite a few doors for you, especially when you're trying to approach some of the more particularly technical water out there.
Yeah, 100%. The other thing I would say, and it's just really a general thing, you know, for me personally, again, has been a flying, like I mentioned, I've fly fished for 40 years now, which is frightening, frankly. I still keep thinking I'm 20, unfortunately not.
It's keeping you young.
It's not really, no. The beauty of fly fishing as a sport is that there is a lifetime of learning.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't matter. You can never, for me personally, I will never become bored of it because, you know, I take as much enjoyment from fishing, you know, traditional spider wet flies upstream on a long rod as I do to fishing traditional, you know, big Western style dry fly patterns occasionally when I'm out west, just for the aesthetic quality of it. It isn't all about, catching huge numbers of fish.
Right.
I like to do that, obviously, especially in competitions, but you know, I've always been of the mind I'm quite happy to catch 1 or 2 fish in a way that I want to catch them on a certain day, as opposed to 20 or 30 when I really have to. So, take from it what you will. If you don't like it, don't do it.
Certainly.
Learn it and understand its advantages, and it might just give you the best day's fishing you've ever had.
Yeah, this is true. Excellent point.
So on that longer approach, from a style standpoint, instantly you think a little bit more traditional and more fly line involved. So now we're actually casting in most of these scenarios. So for me, my preferred method for fishing these kind of big, flat, still complex currented Spring Creek type or tailwater type environments is the dry. I love fishing technical dry fly water. It's hard fishing typically, but in that respect, I find it very, very, very satisfying. So just that shot there, the Missouri, I was actually fishing just the other side of the bridge there in Craig.
Yeah.
On the bit that they send everybody to when they walk into town.
Right.
That's the 3 guys in the shop in front of me were told to go there as well, but I think they headed somewhere else, but which was a mistake because it was full of fish, just like the rest of the river. Yeah, so for me, dry fly, obviously suspension nymphing, I like to do it with a dry dropper, but you can use bobbers and all that kind of stuff. I did do a little bit of that when I was there from a drift boat, and it was great fun. And then the other thing I like to do a lot on these kind of venues is to sight nymph. Single fly, sight fishing without any kind of interference on the line, no bobbers or anything like that, no split shot. I'm not a split shot guy personally. I like to use weight of the fly and the way I fish it to get depth. I think split shot robs you of drift quality in a lot of respects. I know that's probably controversial, but it's just a personal preference.
I was going to ask you about that, and especially with a longer drift, how you're managing where the fly ends up in the water column. And it sounds like it really is just about the particular fly selection and having something that's weighted appropriately so as to not get hung up too quickly on a longer drift.
It is.
I'm gonna sneak in here also, Howard. We also have a question that asked if does drift length matter if you're casting towards the shore? So if you can kind of sneak that in as well, that would be awesome.
If you're casting towards a shore, I mean, it depends really on what kind of shore you're casting to, because a fish that's I'll cover that one first, and then I'll back to your point, Eric. I think when you're casting to fish that are laid up against banks, they're often laid up against the bank for a reason. Sometimes just getting out of the way, but other times they're often looking for infall or things that's either dropping in or becoming pooled, in a back eddy or whatever.
Okay.
In general, that doesn't, to my mind, require as long a drift. Because those fish are often, and it's one of my favorite tactics on any kind of river where I'm fishing to banks, is the old terrestrial plop.
Right.
That is, a dynamite method for fish that are up against banks. And it doesn't really matter where they're sitting either. I've fished the West Branch of the Delaware quite a lot with a really good friend of mine, John Shaner, who's like an East Coast legend over there. And we went fishing one day on there, and one of his favorite methods is to splat beetle patterns on the tail of fish sitting in unreachable places, where they've got their head against a log jam, you can't get to them. He does that classic up behind them. Fly goes in, they spin round and eat it on autopilot, and that's so that's a really good approach for when they're against banks, that kind of stuff. And then to your point, Eric, about managing depth in the water column. So to me, just in my experience, I've often found that it's a very, very rare scenario where the fish get column locked, where they're actually locked into a specific column in the water. Yes, they do key in on certain, phases of emergence, like emergers, they'll often be taking them half in, half out, all that kind of stuff. But when you get down away from that level and you're within the water column, having watched an awful lot of fish feed in a lot of clear rivers over the years, I generally see, to my eyes, much more random within the water column feeding. And the trigger to feed comes from, is the fly behaving in the right way?
Sure. Okay.
So the way that I personally prefer to get the fly to behave in the right way in the water column is if it's over a long drift window in a very, very weedy scenario, or a weedy scenario where you've got to ride, vegetation on the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
I like to go a lot longer and fish a much, much longer line. So if I'm upstream fishing with a dry dropper, for argument's sake, I'll actively manage the drift. And I'm using the dry as a bobber, effectively.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I'm keeping control of it. If I'm not using the dry as a dropper, the one thing I will use sometimes, rather than a bobber, is coloured grease. So effectively, I'll use a mucilin grease or a mucilin type grease, but one that's been cut with basically a fluorescent 50-50 fluorescent orange grease. And it's a trick that competition anglers use because we're not allowed to use bobbers. So we will sometimes use a very buoyant grease on the leader to hold, or I do anyway, to hold a relatively light fly up and drift it over a long space of time.
Gotcha.
If you're not bothered about competition fishing, you can stick a little fold over on or something like that. The key for me is to actively manage the drift over a longer window, get that fly behaving without too much weight on the fly. Because if the fly is light, it will ride the subsurface current and the vegetation on the bottom so much better than if it's pinned by weight.
Sure.
So be it a heavy fly or split shot, So personally, that's my preferred method of that.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So onto the gear a little bit. This is just a little bit I've put in because I want to talk about some of the specific equipment I use. Obviously, it's all hardy. There's no reason why it wouldn't be. I design it. It's my job. So, if I didn't like using it, I would probably have been out of a job several years ago. So generally speaking, close approach, short drifts is long. Just think long rods. Long rods are obviously becoming a lot more popular now in the States. I used to have real uphill battles in seminars and stuff about using longer rods. Nobody really got it. A few guys did, but not that many. And there's good reasons for it. The longer that rod is, when you're not employing a lot of fly line, you have more line control and better contact to your fly by using that longer rod. It really needs a balance between a very flexible tip and a powerful butt section. All of the rods I designed for this style of fishing have got a proportionately softer tip and a proportionately stronger butt. It just makes fishing light flies so much easier. But they're still suitable for larger fish. That thing there it's actually a wild fish. Doesn't look it. It looks like it's come out of a stock pond, but it hasn't. That's a wild fish from a tailwater. It was eating salmon smolts below an inland salmon smolt production facility. They were escaping into the river and it was eating them.
Yeah.
And I landed that rod on one of my favorite that fish on one of my favorite rods, which is a 10-foot 8-inch 0 to 2 weight ultralight. So very, very light rod, but with a strong butt section. And
Sure.
that's heavy water, and I had that fish in the net pretty quickly.
I love it.
For me, they're a great tool, a great all-round tool for big fish, small fish, whatever. They're capable of doing the job.
I think that's an interesting call out as well. I mean, this is something that I was a little bit less familiar until we started fishing some of these rods over the last couple of months. But having that powerful butt section as the complement to a lighter tip, I think I looked at a lot of these rods and assumed because they were 1, 2, 3 weight listed that they were going to be much more delicate and much much more flexible, I suppose. I'm sure you have a better term for that than I do. But to kind of counterbalance that, having something that can effectively fight larger fish or fish in general a little bit better is a kind of a critical component here.
Yeah, definitely. It's got to be suitable for the job. You can get rods with very, very, very light AFTM ratings, you know, which are really noodles. They're really, really soft. They haven't got anything in them. And that's fine for small to even medium-sized fish, but
Mhm.
we all like to, catch a few big ones every now and again. And,
Sure.
you can have effectively the best of both worlds.
Right. Yeah.
So for me personally, the only time I ever use the three weight is when I know that I'm going to be running into a lot of much, much bigger fish. Maybe places like New Zealand and stuff like that.
Mm. Okay.
That's when I'll go for that heavier line size. Just because, when I'm fishing with bigger, heavier flies in, those kind of waters and there's a lot more big fish, you may as well take the advantage of having a little bit more inherent, power there to fight a fish.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so when we go into the longer approach and longer drifts, it's shorter rods. We're back to that slightly more traditional casting, and generally rods between 9 and 10 foot. I very, very, very seldomly go anything less than 9 feet in any of my fishing. Um, because I want the ability to control and mend the line both in the air and on the water. So I want that additional length. Um, it's a balance really between that generating line speed, controlling the loop, and being able to manipulate the line, as I mentioned. So for me personally, my personal preference for all of these kind of techniques for dry fly fishing, anything where I'm casting fly line, is a 9 foot 9 inch rod. That's why I built the ultralights at 9 foot 9 inch. It was a completely selfish motivation. I wanted a 9 foot 9 inch rod, so I made one. In either a 3 or a 4 weight. And how I differentiate between the two is light tippet, small flies, small to average fish, pleasant fishing conditions. I'll use the 3. If I'm facing, windy conditions, maybe fishing for slightly bigger fish, I'll use the 4. One thing I do is underline my rods. So although the rod is rated for a 3 or a 4 weight, my personal preference is I'll put either a 2 or a 3 weight line on it. The reason for that is, I don't want to call myself a professional caster because I'm not, but I do an awful lot of casting, an awful lot of fishing. I can generate a lot of speed with a light line. I don't need to really rely on, the grain loading of the line to flex the rod quite as much as somebody with a bit less experience maybe would. So for me, I generate the line speed, I use high line speed, and it allows me to create tighter, faster traveling loops and also to have more effect on leader placement and tippet placement when I'm fishing. So I like the 9 foot 9 inch rod because when I set the hook in a fish, I get much, much quicker pickup of the line and more importantly, the leader. And when I get into the leaders for dry fly fishing, you'll see why I like that longer rod. And personally, for me, I think it's just a much, much better solution to that style of dry fly fishing. If the wind's honking and I've got to throw really, big flies or I'm out west and stuff, I'll use a 9.5, like the rest of us because it's the right tool for that job. But when it's technical dry fly fishing or sight nymphing, I'll often go that 9.9, 3 or 4 weight at every opportunity for the advantages that it brings. So onto the reels. A reel, you get it, you hear it all the time. It's just a line holder. One of the more common conversations that ends up there now, particularly with the contact nymphing thing, is should you go for a reel that balances the rod perfectly or not? Well, there's two ways to look at that. If you go back into the history of, rod development and product development, if you like, when we were all using Greenheart rods and Lancewood and reels made from brass, you know, balance was a significant thing, because you had these big, long, heavy, slow wooden rods that needed to be offset with a big weighted metal reel. You know, you skip forward to where we are now, this stuff doesn't weigh anything. So yes, balance, if you want to balance it off the end of your finger, fine. There's also an equal school of thought that says, you know, I'd rather just go for the lightest possible rig. So we do lots of reels, obviously, as everybody knows. Some are built to be as light as possible. And this particular one, that's the Aviron Euronymph, has got an adjustable weight system. So if you want to balance it, you can do. I fish that Aviron Euronymph reel quite a lot, but I fish it without the weights. I just like the super large arbor, and I prefer having a disc drag. For me, I'd rather have that drag. The reel's so light, why not? You know, if I'm fishing small fish, medium-sized fish, and I want to, you know, really have it screaming line off the reel and having good fun, I'll use a click check. You know, there's no hard and fast rules for this. Obviously, if you're in New Zealand, maybe best not to go with a click check, go with a disc drag. But for most of our normal fishing, you know, do what you're happy with, you know. Both of those options will work. I wouldn't get too wound up over it. You know, I saw a thread recently on one of the Euronymph forums where people talk about the weight of the backing. You know, I'm not at the point yet where I've decided to start weighing backing, and if I ever get there, I think it's probably time for me to give up. Yeah. So we'll leave the weighing of backing at that point, I think.
In the interest of keeping us moving forward, I think I'm going to leave it there as well.
Yeah. We could do a different one on that, but
That's true.
So I'm going to talk about two distinct styles, or two things that I personally think, if you master them and improve them on either a turbulent or placid environment or a tailwater, wherever you fish, these two things, if you're open to them and you get good at them, can be real game changers in how good you become as an angler, and effectively how effective you are on water. The first one for close approach fishing, and I sort of refer to it as one leader to rule them all. You know, this whole contact nymphing thing is, when you read on the forums and stuff, there is so much talked about, you know, the leaders and how you should build them and what you should make them out of and what color they should be and where you buy the material. It's just endless. It really is endless. For me, I personally prefer to use a microleader, and that's a relatively modern term. It's a term that seems to really have come out of the US. Another term you hear a lot about is a mono rig, an all monofilament rig. So for me, my preference is to fish a micro leader, for want of a better description. And that's again with the nymph, dry dropper, or jigging streamers. How micro it is depends on what I'm fishing for and what the tippet strength's going to be. So I'd encourage people not to do anything crazy and, you know, go chasing huge fish with incredibly thin main leaders, because that just leads to a lot of problems. You've got to be proportionate in what you go for. But my typical micro leader setup now is obviously using a level European style nymphing fly line. A mono rig, you emit the fly line and you just have monofilament on the reel. Personally, I don't do that. The reason being, I'm still an active competitor, and I'm not allowed to. I'm only allowed to have 2 times rod length. In all honesty, if I wasn't an active competitor, I still wouldn't use an all mono rig. I like to handle a thin fly line. I like to have something that even at a push, I could use as a fly line if I needed to. Not that I would generally do that. My leader setup is level. There is no taper in it. Okay. Taper is weight, and I'll get onto that a little bit in a minute. I use level leaders between 0.30 and 0.12. So basically, my level leader at times can literally be the diameter of low breaking strain tippet material. It can be 6x. one trick, if you're at a really high level and you're fishing for not massive fish, small to medium fish, and you want to go down to tippet diameter sized main nymphing leaders, the biggest tip I can give you is to stop trying to find coloured cider material of that diameter that's strong enough, because none of it is. The best thing you can do is use tippet material and then apply colour to it by one of the varying means of colour application. Wax pens, paint pens, all that kind of stuff. Dyed mucilin, whatever you're going to use. Personally, a lot of the time I use something called bristle paint, which is it's a coarse fishing paint that's used for changing the colour of a carp fishing float. It dries in a matter of seconds. It's very visible and it gives a little increase in diameter. And that, for me, when I'm fishing at the very highest level I'm able to, I'll use main leaders of, effectively 6x with a 7x tippet, but the whole thing is just clear. And I'll apply the colour where I want to put it on the leader. For as long as my eyesight lets me do that anyway.
Right.
Not much longer, as it happens. So yeah, that's basically my setup. We've already talked about that a little bit. The Microleader thing, it is really an American con term for some of the level nymphing techniques that we use, or effectively originated over here. There are similarities with some techniques in the US that have been around for years as well. So I'll throw that in. So here's where really, this is the bit to understand about why a light level micro style leader is significantly better than any of the other options when it comes to leader construction. In my opinion, I say my opinion, this is sort of my opinion derived over many years of doing it, but people will come to their own conclusions. And, if it works for you, don't let anybody tell you it's wrong. That's part of the journey of fly fishing, is the more you do it, the more you learn. And in all honesty, I've said it to quite a lot of people. I'm really, really thankful that I grew up and learned how to fly fish before social media and YouTube and all of these, pretty wonderful ways of getting information were out there. Because a lot of my knowledge I learned firsthand. I learned myself, from fishing and not from an online source. And I think that one aspect actually has helped me a lot personally. You do hear a lot of parroted back knowledge, which hasn't come from actually learning it firsthand, unfortunately. So why I like the light level leaders. There was a short spell when thin European nymphing lines came out where people said, oh, well, what you do is you just put the tippet on the end of it. So you have your thin level Euro nymphing leader, you put your tippet on the end and tie your flies to it, which is a really, really poor way of fishing. But there was a spell where a lot of people did that. It's very easy to use because you've still got massive fly line and you're effectively lobbing two heavy flies. They have to be heavy to enable you to tent a relatively heavy European nymphing line. But that's the effect you get on the screen there. You get sag and no direct contact to your fly. And then the next thing really was, what became known as a French style leader. And the origins of a tapered French style leader really came from sight fishing. They were using very, very long tapered monofilament leaders to present weighted nymphs, tiny weighted nymphs, normally pheasant tails, with a little bit of colour to them, to sighted fish. It was a sight fishing method, and an incredibly skillful method, and one that I still use myself whenever I can because it's great fun. But very, very skillful. And that sort of changed into using flies with more weight in them and then adding colour into the leader or a sighter. And for a good number of years, that was the way to do it. You know, when I first started competition fishing a lot, that was like the cutting edge. We had a tapered leader, we had some coloured sighter, and we'd often fish multiple methods off it, including dry flies. And it was like an all-round approach to it. The problem with it is, the second you taper it, when you have taper at the back end, you generate weight, you increase the weight of the leader. And any weight in that leader, particularly when you try and hold the line off the water and tent to the fly and go straight down, you have to increase the fly weight to offset the sag. Or you have to anchor to something in the surface. And that is limiting, you know, for really when we're talking about being at the higher end of it. So that's where the fine level, and I'll use Spanish style. It's widely sort of discussed that it's actually a French guy who really pioneered it for use in competition fishing, but he took it to Spain, used it in Spain, won a lot of competitions, and then it was effectively banned for a short while in France, and the Spanish charged off with it, and it became known as Spanish nymphing. I'm sure the Spanish guys will have a slightly different story. It was a Frenchman who told me that, so you know, I'll take it with a, you know, equal grain of salt. So
Sure.
I don't know who came up with it, but I know that it works. So those fine level Spanish style leaders, they are a bit harder to use, but the main thing is it allows you to reduce the fly weight. Now, if you reduce the fly weight, a lighter fly drifts better, and as a direct result, you get more eats. You know, fly weight, be it from a bead or lead or whatever, the weight of that fly and the way it behaves in the drift can be absolutely critical to getting them to eat it. Yes, the pattern plays into it sometimes, but a lot of times it's the way it behaves. You know, fish do selectively feed, there is no doubt about that. However, having done an awful lot over the years of stomach sampling with a pump, a throat sample, you know, the number of times when I see, you know, to the exclusion of all other, one kind of insect or one emergent stage is really minimal. You know, you can have a fish that's, you know, rammed with spent spinners, and mixed in with it, there's 3 beetles. You know, they're effectively trash feeders a lot of the time. Yes, you know, big emergencies will get them locked onto something, but fly behavior, drift, etc., to me is a much, much more important thing. And probably the last thing I'll sort of say on that one, before people throw bricks at me for it, is, you know, I've been fortunate to look in the boxes of, you know, a lot of world champions. And the one thing that strikes me every time I look in those boxes is the flies are simple. In a lot of cases, they're very, very generic, and they prioritize weight and size more so than specific patterns. You know, everybody's got a few favorites for a specific hatch or something that happens on their local rivers, and that's great. But I'm quite of the belief that if you got 4 or 5 world champions in a line and you mixed all the fly boxes up and said, right, go and have at it, they would all perform just as well as they would with their own fly box. You know, it's very similar, you know, when you look at it. So the lighter leader gives you less sag, more range, better contact, and if you have better contact, you get better conversion. So if you're doing any of these kind of techniques, for me, as light as practically possible is the way to go for me personally. And then finally, I threw that in. That's just an easy reference, you know, ease of use versus range and quality of drift. And for me, the lighter it is, a little bit harder to use, but the much, much better end result you get out of it. So we'll go on to reel fishing, effectively. It shouldn't say reel fishing, it's all reel fishing, but focusing a little bit on dry flies. And again, for me, I touched on it a little bit earlier, and I'm going to call it one leader to rule them all. That, again, that's not specifically accurate because you do need to do certain things sometimes with your leader constructions. But as a concept, the Spanish style dry fly leader, and it does have some similarities to a Hervey slack leader in some ways, and the way that you use it for me has been a game changer in dry fly fishing. I've used it for a number of years now, quite a long time, and the difference in quality of drift and the number of fish that you can fool in incredibly difficult situations with Spanish style leaders has been a real revelation. You can fish dry dropper off it as well. I use a slightly modified version for that, but I'll show you the main dry fly one, and this is an existing published formula that's out there. It isn't my formula. I use a slightly different one. The only reason I'm not sharing it is because it's specific to the way I cast and the way I fish. I build all my own leaders. I do a lot of messing around, and the guys I fish with don't really get any advantage out of the way I build my leader, and I don't get any advantage out of the way they build theirs. But for me, my own personal formula works better. So I'd always encourage people, when you're really getting into your dry fly fishing, is to have a go at leader building and have a go at coming up with your own, what works for you and understand the way in which that leader works. But the basic construction is a progressive taper, and the tapered section is 10 to 11 feet in length. It has a bleed section, and now that bleed section is the red bit there. That's to dissipate power when it's turning over. And then it's got a very, very long extended tip section. And that's a very basic formula there. But that puts that leader in the region of double the rod length for most sort of like 9'6" to 10-foot fly rods. Basically, what it allows you to do is generate control, but then have the leader fold off or fall off to the left or the right, dependent on how you execute the cast. And really what it does is, and this is a little freeze frame from a video that I think you can still find on YouTube that I did about dry fly fishing a long time ago. It's probably over 10 years ago now. And it gives you a little idea of the sort of effect that you can get from that style of leader. It gives you a fly first presentation, even from a downstream position. So when we were talking about like dry fly fishing on rivers like the Missouri, where you've got super complex flows and it's all boily, and the surface is smooth, but it's very convoluted. The standard approach there is a long downstream reach cast to feed the fly first and put the tippet upstream of the dry fly. This allows you to do that from a much, much improved hooking angle, because rather than pulling the fly out of the fish's mouth, you're actually still behind the target and you're striking, into the sort of target zone when they're eating it. So it gives you an exceptional long drag-free drift. And I'll emphasize, with practice, it is as accurate as a standard leader. When I first started using it, and I was over in Spain, I was fishing with one of the top guys who use it a lot. And I had a little bit of not an argument, but a disagreement with him. I said, "Oh, that's great, it's fine, you can use it, but you're relying on, quite an open area to handle this beast of a leader." And he said, "No, you don't." He said, "I can put it anywhere you can put yours." And I was like, "Well, I'm a good caster. I do a lot of tournament casting, so, I'm trying to slot it under a tree. And the guys who are good with this can put it anywhere. Even that tippet, they can fold it, they can get it under things. It's frightening how good you can become with it with practice." So what it looks like when you cast it is basically this. That orange bit there is the tapered section, so that bit is turning over. That red section is that bleed section that dissipates the power. It's only a bleed section because it's longer. So the leader in effect is constantly tapering down. it hits that bleed section, which is longer, that bleeds some of the turnover out of it, and then that allows that tippet to fold left or right, dependent on which way you execute the cast. Now, one of the key things with it, in order to get that fly first presentation and that downstream approach of the fly, the flies coming fly first to the fish from you being in a downstream position, which gives you that hooking angle. The way that you do it, I'll show you in these next few slides. In this image here, where the fish is effectively to my left, that cast has been made off my left shoulder. So I'm right-handed, but I've made the cast in off my left shoulder. And basically, it's what we would traditionally have called a Belgian or an oval cast. So basically, it's a side arm back cast. So when you fish these kind of long, thin Spanish leaders, we start the casting plane off to the side. So effectively, we're making a side cast. And as we come round, we transition basically into an overhead forward cast. So these shots are taken from above. I swing that rod tip round, come on the side, swing it round, and I start to present the cast straight over the top. Now, it can be either a straightforward overhead cast, or you can slice your forward stroke at a varying angle. When you get practiced with it, that is how you control exactly where that tippet section falls versus the main leader. That is the big jump to get your accuracy with these kind of leaders. They all rely as well on high line speed. And if you remember when we talked about rods and lines and how my preference is to underload that line, this is the reason. If I can generate lots of line speed with a low grain weight fly line, it allows me to do a lot more with the leader. And as a really, really nice, useful side effect with all of this, that longer rod and that lighter line, when I lift off the water, that lower diameter thin line lifts much cleaner and much easier than a thicker, heavier grain rated fly line. So I get lovely clean turn off, and when I cast it, it's very, very delicate. I don't get any sort of weight from the fly line going. It's all a much lighter system. And as part of that, when you use these kind of leaders, that back end tapered section should be really heavily greased. So grease your fly line, grease the taper of your leader, obviously stop at the tippet, don't put it on there. And the advantages it gives you are huge. In this scenario, as I mentioned, overhead a slice stroke. The scenario here is that the fish is out to the right-hand side. It's out over on that side. So I'm coming over my right shoulder. If that fish is on the opposite side, it's on that left side, literally, I'm going to make the cast on a side plane out to my left shoulder and I'll come straight over the top. Rather strangely, when I first started to do it, I found it much easier to learn it off my wrong shoulder than off my master shoulder. So, and I think it's partly because naturally, if you cast over this way, you are automatically generating a degree of slice that you don't get when you return from a side stroke on your master shoulder and straight over the top.
Sure.
So for me personally, if you want to try it, I would recommend you maybe try it off your wrong shoulder first. So right-handed, come to your left shoulder. The fish is to the left. That's going to get you that hook and get the fly going in. Fly first off that wrong side.
Gotcha. Yeah,
and honestly, it's if we take it back to what the main subject is, which is tailwaters and difficult, surface conditions, that was a game changer when I fished the Missouri. I fished 3 nights in light hatch conditions below the bridge where everybody else goes, and there was a handful of fish rising every night, and I didn't land them all. I mean, the weed, I was there late in the season, and the weed, it was like a little bit like fishing in a garden center, there was that much of the stuff around.
Yeah, it's like you're casting out on the lawn sometimes. I've been there.
Yeah, and they were threading me through it and wrapping me around it and all sorts. But
Oh yeah.
in little more than an hour's fishing, 3 nights in a row, I stuck 6 really nice fish. Every night I stuck 6. I didn't land 6 every night, and landed between 3 and 4 of them every night on
Yeah.
fishing upstream, which is not normal really for the you
Yeah.
know. I did catch a few fishing downstream as well when the wind picked up. Um, you know, those winds, those winds on some of those rivers is a challenge.
Right.
But yeah.
Howard, before you move on to the next slide, I'm just going to jump in real quick because we have crossed the 1 hour mark in case anyone does need to hop off and get back to work or whatever it is that they might need to do. We did drop in the chat the sign up link for the giveaway. You all were kind enough to donate an ultralight rod for this masterclass, so I want to make sure everyone has a chance to see that. We're also going to kick in 3 lifetime Trout Routes memberships for everyone who's still on the call here today. So if you open up the chat, click on that link and fill out that form. We have a few more slides to go, and then we'll touch briefly on some Trout Routes techniques, but I wanted to make sure everyone at least had a chance to see that before we move on.
Cool. Thanks, Eric. We actually practically there. So we covered that. And the last thing I'm very quickly going to talk about is flies, but we have really already covered it. For me, presentation often trumps pattern. I've never seen the perfect fly, fished badly, outfish the wrong fly fished very well. I think presentation is everything and drift is everything. Fly pattern, yes, plays into it, particularly if they're honed in on a specific kind of food. Even if it's only just to the level of it gives you more confidence to tie something on that looks like what they're eating. Sometimes it's a mental game as much as anything else. I try to have less flies but more weights and sizes, be it unleaded, lead wraps or beads. I have a lot of flies that don't have beads on them and just have lead in them or lead-free wire, whatever you want to use. But I'm a believer in weight to get good drift, or lack of weight in some cases. And adding situation, venue-specific patterns to your framework of confidence flies. Things that will, are relevant to your fishery. Have them in there. They don't take any space up. What I would advise you to stay away from is over confusing it with fly patterns of every type, color, size. Concentrate on generating good quality drifts, fishing clean, and you will catch more fish. Finally, that's it. I mean, thanks for listening. I don't know if there's any questions you want to cover or not. You want to jump straight into your stuff, but it's been great to talk to you all, and I hope you've enjoyed it and found something useful out of it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Howard. I'm not going to share any slides here. I just wanted to throw a couple of things out there to the folks that are still with us, where we can take some of this information and pair it with the resources that we have built out in Trout Routes. And because we're talking tailwaters, the most obvious thing that I would love to have folks check out is when you open up the app, we have built in a tailwaters only filter option. So you can literally go into the filters list, select tailwaters only, and it will hide everything else except for tailwater fishing opportunities. So as we're talking about these different waterways, that's, I think, really going to be key in helping you very quickly identify all of these areas that we can take these tips and techniques and apply them directly to the water. While we are more or less in the winter season, I think that tailwaters also are incredibly important because, as you mentioned at the top, water temperature tends to be a little bit more consistent, so we can usually rely on these waters being open and not frozen over, especially for the next couple of months. And so pairing those tailwaters within the app, as well as with some of the things like satellite e-scouting, I think can be really beneficial, especially in this time of year, to help you dial in these access points and these areas that you might be targeting, so that you can spend more time putting these techniques to work when you're actually out on the water. I know we do have a bunch of questions that we want to get to here as well, so I think I'm going to leave it there for now. We will be sharing some additional winter fishing techniques as well as some more info on fishing tailwaters with trout routes. So make sure, if you're not already, follow along on our social channels on Instagram. Make sure you check out our YouTube channel. I think I did see a couple of questions about whether this is going to be reposted or not. We are going to throw this on the Trout Routes YouTube channel once we complete the recording today. So for everyone who's been asking, I know Matt's probably earmarked that one a couple of times. Yes, you will have access to this later on. I know there's been a lot of information that we've covered today, and I want to make sure that you have a chance to get back into it down the road.
Awesome. Thank you for passing that off to me. I'm just going to ask some questions here. We'll fire them off, the ones that came in during class. We also did have some come in before via email, so we'll try to get through as many of them that came in through class over the next 15 minutes or so before we cut class off. So I'll start here with the first question that we had of the day from Josh, asking, generally speaking, how far below a dam do these tailwater characteristics exist, and when does a river stop being a tailwater?
I think personally, I mean, it's really situational specific. It's got to be really, because they're all different. I mean, it could be any length, right? I mean, I've fished some, believe it or not, I fished some tailwaters in South Korea, and they were incredibly short areas of tailwater-like characteristics, and then they turned into almost like freestones with a lot of incoming side channels, and throwing a lot of extra water in, and the true tailwater-like portion of it was literally a matter of a few hundred yards, So I think it varies. I mean, if it's below a hydrological structure, it's a tailwater. For me personally, that doesn't matter so much as to where the delineation is between it's a tailwater, it's not. I'm more interested in concentrating on fishing the water that's there effectively, in the right way.
Awesome. Perfect. Let's see. Next one. Can you comment on the advantages or disadvantages of a double nymph rig? A heavier point fly to get the desired dropper fly to depth. In Brian's experience with technical tailwaters, drag has always been an issue with a double nymph rig.
Yeah, it's good. It's a good point, and it's right. I mean, for me personally, I always look at the dropper fly. The dropper fly can be really valuable, but you need to understand that it's interference in contact. So everyone has, or a lot of people have in the mind, this sort of picture that when you put a double nymph rig on and you throw it in the river, that you've got this like straight line that runs down the leader, through the dropper to the point fly, and the dropper hangs off perfectly straight, and it's fishing nice, and that's not true. You end up with a significant amount of angle or lack of direct line contact caused by the weight point at the dropper. So double nymph rigs, I use double nymph rigs quite a lot. Personally, if I can fish a single nymph, I fish a single nymph because it has a lot of advantages in terms of quality of drift, direct contact to the fly, and it is a lot more accurate when you're slicing very, very complex water. Putting two flies close enough to each other to maintain good drift in the same drift line is very, very, very difficult. Putting a single fly in is a lot easier. And I honestly think fishing single flies a lot of time make me fish a lot better, personally. I get much cleaner drifts, I fish things more thoroughly. And it's a go-to method for me, particularly when it's hard.
Awesome. Next question. Is there a rod that works well for North Country spiders and Euro nymphing?
Yeah, I mean, you can use most of our longer rods will still fish North Country spiders well. A longer rod, particularly if you're fishing them upstream, is a big advantage because it allows you to keep a little bit of separation between you and the fish. My preferred method of fishing spiders North Country style is a method that's often called the escalator, which was something that Oliver Edwards, the late Oliver Edwards, a very good friend of mine, popularized and really conned the term for it, where you're literally making an across stream presentation with an upstream mend, and controlling the elbow of line on the water. So for me, when I'm spider fishing, I like rods of around 10 feet in length. I typically use, I mean, I'm a different case probably because I work in the industry and I design fly rods for a living. So when I go fishing, I usually take about 30 with me. You know, some of them work projects and other just, you know, stuff that I've not taken out of the boot of the car. So if I want to spider fish, I'll often use a 10 foot, you know, 3, 4 weight marksman, something like that. If I was going to spider fish with one of the marksman, sorry, the ultralight LL rods, I'd probably use a 10-2-2 and fish it with a 2 or 3 weight line just for the fun of it, you know, because
Right on.
that's
Awesome.
a good crossover rod.
Cool. Cool. Next one. If you had to fish one tailwater and one fly for the rest of your life, what would it be? This is a fun one.
That's a difficult one. I, like a lot of anglers, have a real affinity with the Madison. It's partly because it was the first famous Western river that I fished because I'd always read about it. I'd always wanted to go, and I went and fished a long, long time ago. I managed to get on the Madison on a work trip, and it's a true story. The first fish I caught out of the Madison was actually a complete and utter unicorn, and it gave me a very, very, very distorted picture of the fish in the Madison for quite a long while. I think the first fish I actually had out of that river was 24.5 inches, and I thought they were all that big.
Yeah, that's a unicorn for sure.
And the guide freaked out, and I was like, "Yeah, he's putting it on. You know, you know, he's trying to bull me up a lot here," and it
Right.
wasn't. And I've never had one that big since, or even seen one close to it. But it would probably be the Upper Madison because I love that river. And if I had to fish one fly up there, that's a difficult one. I would probably just fish um, something like an olive perdigan of some description.
There we go.
Um,
Well, that answers another question. We already had what's your favorite perdigon nymph as a question. So we answered two in one there. How about that?
yeah, well, actually, it's not my favorite perdigan.
Oh
My
boy.
actual,
All right.
my all round favorite perdigan is probably a black and red
Mm,
Pantaglista,
classic.
the classic Spanish. You know, just because it doesn't look like anything and they still eat it. You
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. I like it. All right, next one. What kind of pen do you use to put color on the leader? I know you mentioned a couple different options. Do you have a go-to pen style coloring applicator?
Yeah, so I used to use the Sakura paint markers that you can get. I think Scientific Anglers sell the same thing now with a, you know, it's just basically the same thing. It's a Sakura marker. Um,
Yep.
I used to use that one a lot. I still do occasionally. Personally now I prefer to use, um, it's a company called Census. They sell a product called Bristle Paint, which is actually, I just so happen to have
There you
some
go.
bottles of it. That's the
There
white
we
one.
go.
It's like a paint on. It's like Tipex, but they do it in white, yellow, orange, and black. It goes on. It adds a little bit of diameter. It does come off. You can flake it off in use if you want to get rid of it, and you do need
Cool.
to top it up every so often. But that's what I use.
Awesome. All right, moving on to the next one. In regards to the Spanish leader, is that a leader that you're going to have to build yourself, or is that something that you could walk into a fly shop and find something comparable to purchase off of the rack?
I'm assuming the dry fly leader is that the Spanish style dry fly leader.
I believe so. Yes, I believe
Yeah.
that's what this
Okay.
question is.
So don't panic too much if you don't want to make your own. There isn't a relatively easy way to do it. You can buy like a 12-foot normal tapered leader, 12-foot normal tapered nylon leader, and then just basically trim a little bit out from the butt because one thing I didn't mention is most of the leaders that we build for that style are proportionately slightly thinner in the butt because we use low diameter lines, so we're not using, you know, the thick, heavy tapered butt section that you get on most commercial leaders. So chew in a little bit from the back and then add a very, very long tippet. and you will be able to manage well enough with that to master it. Some of the Spanish guys I know, they like to use a hen's tapered leader, a very, very long. They're actually sold for European nymphing, but they use them for dry fly fishing, but they cut them in a specific way, and it saves them having to tie all the sections. So yes, you can make do with it. Just find something that works. The long tippet and the bleed section are the two most important things.
Awesome. All right, this one is specifically about the ultralight LL rod. For the average angler fishing tailwaters using a combination of both dries and nymphs, which of the ultralight rods would you say is the best, the ultra?
So this is a get out. This is like me getting out the question. I always carry two rods. I'm fortunate. I know that I've got access to a lot of gear. If I had to have one crossover, I would probably use something like the 10-2-2 because a good friend of mine, very well-known trout fisherman, over in the UK, his nickname is One Rod. So he literally just fishes one rod for everything. And he uses that 10-2-2 to the exclusion of all others. And he does fish both styles with it. My approach has always been, I'd rather have exactly the right tool for the right job, and I'm willing to carry two rods.
Yeah, I guess that's a personal preference, whether you like having to set one down on the bank or whatever it might be if you're carrying multiple rods, right? So
Yeah, that's it.
awesome. Next question is, do you have a place that you would love to fish that you haven't had a chance to yet?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, there's always somewhere else to fish, right? That's the thing. Um, for me, I haven't been to Patagonia or Argentina, places like that. I would love to go down there and maybe fish somewhere down there. I've done a lot of saltwater fishing in South America, but I haven't done any of the sort of trout fishing in that kind of area.
Right on. Awesome. So kind of staying on that vein of fishing different places, how, in your experience, does fishing differ from country to country, and how did you enjoy the worlds in France?
Oh, it differs. I mean, it doesn't differ wildly. I mean, there's certain quirks and everything, and France I really enjoyed, in all honesty. Um, it was great fishing. It was tough fishing in a lot of instances. The lakes were incredible. That high alpine lake fishing in the camperels and the carlets was magical fishing. Crystal clear water, rising fish, sight nymphing. Yeah, really, really good. It'll be of interest to people maybe, but there's about to be launched a six-part documentary that was filmed over 9 months, which includes the entire World Championships.
Very cool.
It'll be put out by Fulling Mill towards the end of the month, I think.
Awesome. Well, everyone's going to have to be keeping their eye out for that. All right, we're coming down to some of the last questions here, and we're coming down on time, so we'll sneak in a few more. Um, well, this one was, do you take a nymphing rod and a dry fly rod with you when you fish? I think you've already answered that one, that you're a multi-rod guy, so that's an
I
easy one to
am, yeah.
get through. Next one is, any tips for tight lining in deeper, slow water? And then the add-on is, where is the best fish and chips in England?
All the fish and chips are good in England. Oh, it's
There we
better on
go.
the north. It's better on the northeast coast where I live because I'm right near the sea, so they just pull it straight out of there, so it's
Oh,
fresh.
That
So
sounds great.
be good. So the nymphing in slower, deeper water.
Hmm.
Um, so the best way I would say to approach it, I don't always specifically target those areas, but obviously sometimes that's where the fish are. And if you want to approach them like that, for me, that's where that level leader really plays into it. The advantage of fishing a long, thin, level micro leader is that you can submerge a large proportion of it without any really negative drag. So if you're using that thicker tapered or either thicker level Euro style leader, you're going to get a lot of additional drag and interference as you start to submerge all the taper down into the water. That's why when I fish that thin stuff, I often use clear. And if I'm fishing, let's say I'm fishing very light with like a 0.14 main line and a 12 or a 10 tippet, what I could do in very deep water is rub off the bristle paint, get rid of that, move the indication right the way back up the leader, and then just fish it down and let it drop really deep. So effectively I've changed the indication point on my leader and the length of my tippet without doing anything other than rubbing off a bit of paint and repositioning it. And that's one of the big advantages of fishing that long, thin stuff, is it eliminates or reduces massively the need to keep re-rigging tippet length, indication, position, all of that stuff. You know, it's a real direct way to do it.
Awesome. And the last one here, any tips for getting very small nymphs, aka 22 and smaller, down to depth without split shot? And I know you mentioned you're not a split shot guy.
Yeah, so it depends on the approach, how you're fishing it. And one way to do it is longer drift, so throw it further and let it sink under its own impetus. The dodge that sometimes we use or sometimes I use when competition fishing, if it's a scenario where I can get close enough to the fish, I'll just drive it in. You know, so I'll basically tuck cast it to break surface tension and get it to go down faster. Make sure you're fishing as thin a tippet as you can, and make sure the fly is designed in such a way that it sinks fast. So basically a soulless perdigan. I had to get the soulless one in.
There we
So
go. There we go.
just to get it down fast, you know, so yeah, that's the main way. The other thing is to make sure your flies get deeper if you have a vertical sight or angle. So if you go more vertical over the top of the flies and get over the top of it if you can, the longer rod obviously helps you do that at better range. That will get you deeper in the water column as well.
Awesome. All right, one last one. It's from Jamie Noon, if that name means anything to you. He's asking, did you have to pay Lucy image rights for the photo on the first slide?
God, I've got famous people on the call and everything.
How about that?
That
All
is
right, Eric, I'm going to pass it back to you because that wraps up our Q&A.
All right. Well, Howard, once again, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate this conversation and the several conversations that we had leading up to today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've learned a whole lot, and I've got an awful lot of things that I'm going to take with me to the water the next time I happen to get out. Appreciate everyone for asking those questions and for jumping in here. And I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I'm hoping that we can bring you more of these kinds of conversations in the very near future. But Howard, thank you a ton. That was absolutely incredible. I'm very much appreciated.
great. Thank you very much, guys. Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for calling in. Much appreciated.
Thanks, everyone. We'll catch you on the next one.